Infamous Murders examines 3 notorious cases of cannibalism. In the first, the killer took young men to his apartment, cut up their bodies and put them in his freezer. In the second, a murderer terrorized Russia and killed at least 53 people. In the third, a killer disposed of women he thought resembled his dead mother and ate them. When Milwaukee police arrived at a flat late one July night in 1991, they couldn't believe what they found. A freezer containing human body parts, including 3 severed heads, 2 skulls in a cooking pot, and 3 torsos stuffed into a large plastic barrel. A terrified young man had flagged down a police car and told them he'd been abducted by the occupier of the flat. He was lucky to escape. Residents of Milwaukee later discovered that up to 17 young men had died there, in a combination of slaughterhouse and torture chamber. The men were killed over a 13-year period by Jeffrey Dahmer. He had dismembered the bodies, cooked and eaten parts of them. Dahmer killed for the first time when he was just 18, at his parents' home in Ohio. He picked up a young hitchhiker and took him home. After a few beers, the hitchhiker tried to leave and Dahmer strangled him. The disappearance went unexplained for 13 years. The victim was 19-year-old Stephen Hicks. A police spokesman explained what happened.
When Jeffrey picked up a barbell and struck him in the backside of the head, he later then strangled him with the same barbell and then took him to a location where the body was dismembered, and then later, several days later, took the body parts and disposed of them.
Dahmer concealed his crime so well that even after he'd told police where to look, they found almost no trace of Hicks' body. Friends from school remembered Dahmer as odd.
I felt real strongly, always, like something very tragic was going to happen.
After failing at college, Dahmer joined the army and served as a medical orderly in Germany. But he drank heavily and was discharged after 2 years. He then drifted into badly paid jobs and went to live with his grandmother in Milwaukee. In September 1987, Dahmer met a young man in a gay bar and killed him in a nearby hotel. Dahmer put the body in a suitcase and took it to his grandmother's, where he cut it up to put in the rubbish. A year later, Dahmer moved into his own flat. His grandmother was fed up with his drunkenness and the smell from her basement. He told her it was just rubbish, but Dahmer had killed again. In May 1991, Dahmer lured a 14-year-old boy to his home, but the boy managed to escape and a passerby alerted the police. When questioned, Dahmer told police the boy was 19 and that they were having a lover's quarrel. The passerby remained worried and called the police once again. They did not respond.
It's all taken care of, ma'am.
Are you sure?
Ma'am, I can't make it any more clear. It's all taken care of. That's, he's with his boyfriend and his boyfriend's apartment where he's got his belongings also.
But
that's where it's released.
Isn't this, what if he's a child and not an adult? Are you positive this is an adult?
Ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
Like I explained to you, it's all taken care of. It's as positive as I can be.
Left alone with the boy, Dahmer killed him. The decision was difficult for Police Chief Philip Areola to explain.
The investigation further discloses that the police department individuals who responded failed to conduct a basic, proper police investigation into the matter.
Dahmer was eventually arrested in July of 1991. By then, he'd killed up to 17 people and eaten parts of their bodies. His last intended victim was meant to be Tracy Edwards. Dahmer met him in a shopping mall and invited him back. Once home, Dahmer gave Edwards a spiked drink. Dahmer then tried to handcuff Edwards, but Edwards fought him off, ran outside and flagged down a police car. Officers thought it was a false alarm until they asked Dahmer for the keys to the handcuffs. Dahmer went berserk, and the officers had to use force to subdue him. Then they noticed the stench of rotting flesh, and Dahmer admitted his crimes. He was soon brought in for the pre-trial hearings. Dahmer showed no sign of emotion during the reading of his charges. Milwaukee's largest murder investigation was finally over.
As to counts 1 through 8, you are charged with first-degree intentional homicide, which carries a life imprisonment.
Given Dahmer's crimes, his sanity seemed questionable. But when asked if he understood what was going on, he said he did.
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
You also understand.
With Dahmer off the streets, the citizens of Milwaukee expressed their feelings.
3 years ago, this was probably one of the safest cities in the country to live.
Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. He was charged with 15 murders, and the prosecution refused to accept a plea of insanity. The court heard details of Dahmer's cannibalism.
We're not talking about an urge to eat chocolate-covered donuts. We're talking about an urge for corpses.
In February, he was found guilty. 2 days later, Judge Lawrence Graham sentenced Dahmer to 15 consecutive life terms.
F912542, special verdict. Question number 1. Did the defendant Jeffrey L. Dahmer have a mental disease? Answer.
But in November 1994, Dahmer was killed in prison. A fellow inmate crushed his head with a metal bar. By 1990, dozens of people had gone missing from Rostov, the largest city in southern Russia. Several of the bodies, some of which had been mutilated, were found along the banks of the River Don and in the woods and fields outside the city. Police thought the killer might work on the railways and be targeting passengers. More than 3,000 officers were positioned at stations across the region. But despite the massive police presence, the killer committed 2 more murders. He slipped through the police net at Donlesko station and dragged his victims off. By now, the police were desperate. The public were terrified and pressure was mounting to catch the murderer before he struck again. But in November 1990, it suddenly stopped. Police had been watching their main suspect, but needed a reason to take him into custody. Then the suspect attacked 2 young boys and the police arrested him. The man was Andrei Chikatilo, a 54-year-old railway engineer. At first, he refused to confess to anything other than acts of perversion towards young children. Then, psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky was brought in.
When I started working with Chikatilo, I gave him the psychological profile which I had written for the investigators. I said, read it and tell me if I understood you or not.
Chikatilo broke down completely and confessed. He began to show investigators where he had disposed of the victims' remains. But he refused to say why he had eaten some of their organs. He only told Bukhanovsky he'd been on a mission.
Chikatilo explained that his killings were to make society healthier, sparing it of prostitutes, drunks, and thieves.
Photographs taken of Chikatilo at the time of his arrest matched the sketches police had used to find him. When police searched Chikatilo's flat, they found 23 knives that he'd used to kill. He had been preying on the innocent for nearly 13 years, often violating and cannibalizing their bodies after death. Chikatilo's first victim was a 9-year-old girl, whom he'd killed in December 1978. 6 years later, another man was wrongly charged with the murder and executed. More killings followed. Many of the victims were young children whose bodies were usually found within a few days. From 1982 on, Chikatilo had been on an astonishing rampage. In 1984 alone, he slaughtered 15 people, sometimes carelessly discarding the bodies. As he led investigators to his killing grounds, they could scarcely believe the scale of his crime. It was clear that Chikatilo was one of the worst mass murderers of all time. He was eventually brought into Rostov's main court in 1992 after 16 months in custody. There was chaos in court as relatives of the victims cried out for revenge. Chikatilo seemed confused, at first unable to answer even the simplest questions. He was charged with 53 murders. Although Chikatilo's behavior in court appeared bizarre, psychiatrists had decided that he was quite sane, even though he gave every appearance of being completely demented. He was under constant watch by Alexander Bukhanovsky. For his own safety, Chikatilo was confined to a steel cage. He told the crowded court that he had no idea why he'd killed so many people, and described himself as a mad beast, a freak of nature. At times, the evidence was so gruesome that even the guards were overcome. 6 months later, it was all over. Chikatilo, with a full head of hair, was found guilty. The judge said that Chikatilo had planned each murder with care, so his sanity was not in doubt. Chikatilo responded by screaming insults from his cage. He claimed he was a victim of Soviet oppression. In October 1992, Judge Leonid Akubzhanov sentenced Chikatilo to death. The waiting was over at last for the relatives. Chikatilo was led away to await execution. A bullet to the back of his head. Almost 35 years earlier, another murderer was sent to a mental institution for life after killing 2 women and mutilating the corpses of 15 more that he dug out of their graves. Plainfield, Wisconsin, a small town in the heart of the American Midwest, was aptly named. It consisted of a few farms, houses and shops, and a bar called Hogan's Tavern. But in December 1954, the bar owner, Mary Hogan, mysteriously disappeared. A local farmer stopped by for a drink, found the tavern open but deserted. There was dried blood on the floor and a spent rifle cartridge nearby. Police combed the area but came up with nothing. Mary seemed to have vanished without trace. The police were certain something had happened to her. Then Ed Gein, a shy man in his mid-50s who had lived alone since his mother's death, told a local farmer that he knew where Mary was. The farmer didn't believe him. Almost 3 years passed. Plainfield was a hunting town and its deer season fell in November. Ed Gein had been brought up on a farm but did not hunt. Instead, in November 1957, he went to the local hardware store, picked up a new rifle off a rack, loaded it, and shot owner Bernice Warden in the back. Gein carried her body outside, tossed it in the back of her truck, and drove back to his farm. But he was seen. News of Bernice's disappearance spread quickly.
A horrible crime like this committed in their midst. These were very warm people, friendly people, unsuspecting people.
Police visited Gein's farm and brought him in for questioning. He was evasive and contradictory. They were sure he had killed Bernice Warden. Local residents were scared.
I watched the late news at 10 o'clock, and the newsman said that there had been a murder in Plainfield, but they didn't say who or what kind or anything. So I ran across just a little driveway and asked Irene if she knew anything about it. And she said yes, that it was Mrs. Warden that was killed. And she said, "You'll never guess who they picked up." And I said, "Well, who was that?" She said, "Eddie Gein." And we couldn't, either one of us, believe that he would hurt anybody. And that was really all she knew. So we discussed it, and we just knew Eddie wouldn't hurt a fly. So I went home and locked my door for the first time in years.
Police then searched Gein's house. He lived in such squalor that they scarcely knew where to begin. They had a feeling they were not going to like what they'd find. The house had no electricity, and detectives used torches and were shocked by what they discovered in an adjoining building. Hanging from the ceiling was the headless corpse of a woman, like a gutted deer. The officers picked their way through piles of rubbish, broken furniture, and filthy clothes. They soon found the remains of Mary Hogan, along with at least 9 shrunken heads and other body parts which Gein had scattered throughout the house. Confronted with the evidence, Gein broke down and confessed to killing Mary Hogan in 1954 and Bernice Warden 3 years later. He also told police that he'd been digging up the graves of women who were long dead and eating their bodies. Gein was found unfit to stand trial and committed to a state mental institution on the 6th of January 1958. But 10 years later, he was considered sane enough to appear before a court. After a week, it was clear he was anything but. The man, known as the Plainfield Butcher, was recommitted. In February 1974, Gein petitioned for release. But the judge ruled that the aging psychopath was not yet ready to rejoin society. Psychiatrists thought that it was Gein's obsession with his dead mother which drove him to murder and to dig up corpses. He was looking for a substitute for the only woman he'd ever loved, even though she had rejected him as a child and despised men in general, especially Gein's drunken father. The case fascinated the country and inspired one of the most famous and frightening films ever made, Psycho, in which a man's brooding and irrational obsession with his dead mother leads to murder. Based on a book by Robert Bloch and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. In the film, Gein's remote farm became a roadside motel. Norman Bates was based on Ed Gein, although his crimes paled in comparison to Gein's atrocities. Ed Gein died in July 1984. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery next to his mother. History has revealed the existence of depraved individuals who want to taste human flesh. Dahmer and Chikatilo killed at least 70 people to satisfy their needs. But Ed Gein's crimes were even worse, digging up and eating rotting corpses. All 3 murderers are now dead, but there are probably still others like them out there.
Well, next tonight, horror stories of innocent people who are convicted of crimes they didn't commit. Many spent decades in prison before finally being exonerated. Others were not so lucky and carried the mistakes made by the criminal justice system for the rest of their lives. Hard Time, No Crime, after the break.